Hi and welcome to another live Q&A. Today I've got Colin Glass OBE, Director of Murray Harcourt. How are you, Colin?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you very much, Johnny.
Delighted to have you here. I mean, when I first got to know you, you've got an accountant background. That's your big skill. I've still got you, don't worry. That's your big skill. But the more I've got to know you, your expertise in business is immense. You've got so many experiences. You were thrown into the deep end at a very young age. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, I've got a very obsessive personality. So in the late 60s, early 70s, I was very, very interested in the stock market and always wanted to get involved in the public company field, which eventually I managed to do. But at that time, obviously without any money and wanting to start our own business, I first of all worked for a small investment bank and then a small public company, and then we started on our own with a good friend of mine, Melvin Winburn, and another guy called David Norfolk. And so we formed Winburn Glass Norfolk, which was an accountancy practice, because in those days accountants had a bit of kudos about them, so we didn't want to call ourselves anything fancy. But I suppose our USP was the high risk approach, where we were prepared to roll up our fees, which is a euphemism in a lot of cases, and write them off and take small equity stakes in the businesses that we were helping and go on a journey together. If you found the right entrepreneur, which over the years, fortunately, I managed to find a few, and we could build businesses together, exit them or float them on AIM, and that was the sort of basis of the career.
Sorry, just to welcome everyone, by the way, we're live streaming on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. This is also going to be a podcast as well, so you might be listening to us right now. It's great to have you all here. I've noticed that we've got some comments on Facebook already. We've got quite a lot of viewers on LinkedIn. If you've got questions for Colin, please do ask. Chris Rabbit has just said good morning. We've got someone on Facebook saying morning, good to hear from you both. But if you've got questions for Colin, please do ask. Colin, you said that accountants used to have a lot of kudos. Does that mean that that's not the case nowadays then?
No, I don't think it has. Nowadays, the world has changed, and you probably read in the press, especially the big four have got into bother quite a few times on a regular basis, but they seem to get through all that, whereas smaller firms, their knuckles get well and truly wrapped if they step out of line in any way. But no, the world has changed. Mainly the media have made it more accessible to know what accountants do, what entrepreneurs do. And so, as I say, it's a different scene now. The ecosystem, to use that word, is different, especially for small companies, SMEs. Yeah, that's how it works.
Welcome to Tim Kitchen, who's watching us. Morning, guys. He says, and Phil Fraser. He's asking a question which actually, to be perfectly honest, I was about to ask you anyway, because you talked about stock markets. It piqued my interest. I like to have a play with stocks and shares. My father got me into that at a very young age. Phil's asking, what is Colin's best investment and worst?
Well, that's a good question. It's hard to tell, but one of the best investments was in a company called Imperial Energy, which there was a very charismatic lawyer in Leeds called Peter Levine, who had interests. He was a Russian speaker and had interests in oil in Russia, and he put these interests together into a company called Imperial Energy, which was on AIM to start with, and started literally with a small base, and ended up selling out many years later. It started at 25p, and I can't remember how much it sold out for, about £12 per share some years later. But you always talk about your winners, not the Not the losers. I don't know what is diverse
You-
investment. I can't think. Yeah.
You're so good that there's not been any at all.
No, there's been
So,
plenty.
so well, I mean, you say yourself you've been through lots of ups and downs with different businesses over your career, and all of that has given you huge amounts of experience. We're going to talk about your prolific networking. You're very prolific at networking. You also talk about what makes businesses work. You very much believe that that it's all about people as well, and I'm sure you must have a lot of insight on the financial side of things. Being I only recently found out that you're a non-exec director of the British Business Bank. So, but before we get into all of that, I just want to understand a bit more about Colin and how what made you become an accountant.
Well, I wasn't very good at doing maths, physics, chemistry at school in A level, and I really didn't know what I was wanting to do. But as I say, one of my closest friends, Melvin Wimburn, had gone directly, as you did in those days, into doing accountancy. And he got me interested in the stock market, and I suppose indirectly through that, I thought I'd do this degree in accounting, and that's how it really started. But it wasn't the accountancy. It's a great training. It's great training for people, especially in those days. And you were very hands-on with small companies, sort of doing the basics and learning about the companies. So it was really good training. But my interest, as I say, was more that I wanted to become the next Jim Slater. For those old enough or who want to look in up, Jim Slater was a great investment banker in the 60s and 70s, Slater Walker Securities, and built a whole empire by finding sleepy public companies who we could approach and say that I'm going to revamp you, I'm going to remarket what you're doing, let me in, and I'll show you how to raise the share price so everybody benefits. That was it in a nutshell. Eventually became the unacceptable face of capitalism. I think that was in Edward Heath's reign, but it was very interesting. There were quite a few lookalikes that started similar businesses, and I one of them in Leeds, Peter Grimshaw, I went to work for, and for 3 years it was a great experience. Sort of researching smaller companies that we could invest in.
What were the typical things he would do then if he was going into these sleepy companies and trying to increase the share price? What was, what were they doing wrong? What were the key things?
Well, one was marketing, building brand images. A lot was doing it by acquisition, because the one good thing about a public company, you've got collateral, you've got shares that you can issue to purchase a company. And this is what happened. And so you could build quite big conglomerates by starting with a small publicly quoted company, especially going back in that era, and build substantial companies. Peter Grimshaw's was a sleepy company in Ossett called Windsor and Firth. I remember, they asked me what happened last week, but I can remember that, Windsor and Firth. He renamed it Grimshaw Windsor, and started to acquire, it was in the sort of DIY area, and acquired similar companies and built up quite a big group, of which his main investment bank had a holding. He also used to manage portfolios of very wealthy individuals, and he put part of their shares, part of their portfolios into the shares of the companies that he was investing in. So it was good while it lasted.
So it's a bit of having the right names on the board, having but a big part is actually looking big. So that brand you talked about, that branding there. Actually, it's making sure that from the outside in, it looks like a serious, big, professional company. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the ways to get it noticed, particularly in the stock market. I mean, let's be honest, most people are not that interested. Most investors who dabble in the stock market, not the professionals so much, but they're more interested in what's going to happen to the share price. All the rest is to some degree peripheral. They're not going to delve into it. Some do, obviously, and that's private investors, and obviously the funds do that. But at the end of the day, it is how you can leverage the share price. And part of this was image, particularly in this area where he was, in that era, he was really well known. And he bought into a number of companies. One was called Pennine Motors. I can't remember what it was called before. And it was a sleepy motor company. And then he got sort of distributorships for, the most modern cars, and it was sort of self-feeding. And it became, in its own right, a good company.
One of the early businesses you were involved in, I think you were really thrown into it with creditors chasing you and all sorts of things. What were the experiences that you got out of that? You were thrown in the deep end with that? Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. That was when I was working for Cope Sportswear. It was a year after I'd left Grimshaw's, before we started on our own, and it was the time of the oil crisis in where they were talking in the press about petrol rationing. In fact, they actually issued petrol coupons. They never, I think, put them into use. And Geoffrey Cope, sadly, who passed away last year, he was really entrepreneurial, a real character, and I learned a lot from him. And he came across his company in Halifax, which was converting cars to run on LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which was becoming all the rage then because of this, media frenzy about saying there was going to be petrol rationing. Of course, people didn't realise so much that propane gas or LPG comes from cracking oil. You burn it off, and there was a longer term economic reason for getting involved in this in this industry, because this was a use for the gas that previously they'd been burning off. However, this small company in Halifax had got a distributorship from a Dutch company, a leading Dutch company, for the conversion equipment. And Geoffrey interviewed this guy with a view to buying conversions for his reps' cars, but he thought this was a great company to invest in. It's only a small company, and literally sort of phoned me up in the office upstairs and said, "Come down, I've got this interesting thing, tell me about it," and said, "You're going to run it." I said, "Well, what do you mean I'm going to run it? I've never been outside an office, really." He says, "Well, you'll learn." And literally the next day, had to go to Halifax. It was a half-built site, building there, and God, it was a real mess. But there were some characters, and we managed to sort of save it. Literally, there were creditors knocking at the door, and we managed to save it, and there was quite a lot of publicity at the time. But then the oil crisis died down, and that industry never went forward. But at the time, Geoffrey had decided that he was going to cut back and get rid of all non-core activities, including this business. So I said, "Well, what's going to happen to me?" And he said, "Well, you can come back into the company." I said, "Well, not really. Can I take it with me, because I want to start on my own?" So he said, "Well, you can take it with me. So with you." So we then started the practice, myself, Melvin Wimburn, and a guy called David Norfolk, only because we didn't really want to, well, we needed to earn a living as well. So we had a few clients that we'd picked up. You couldn't advertise in those days, but I was virtually seconded to this company, which eventually we sold, and we started the practice. But the key thing at that point was that I was obsessed with, as I say, the investment banking scene, but didn't have any money. So I said, what we should do, because people can't even pay our modest fees, those companies we're going to advise, we should roll up our fees and take a small equity stake. So they said, "You can't do that, shock horror, how are we going to earn a living?" So they said, "Well, we'll just have to manage." And we didn't do it in every case, but that's what we did. And we were very fortunate that the first company was a case study of what you can do from starting a business with 80 quid, I think it was, in a back bedroom, and building it up and selling it out 18 years on to a subsidiary of a major merchant bank. It was a story on its own, and sadly too long to tell here, but I have fond memories of that. And that started this sort of scene going with other ones that we were involved. But as I say, the key thing is the entrepreneurs who are running these companies and the relationship you create with them. And I've been very, very fortunate to work with some great people. One of them, Johnny Straight, who is a great entrepreneur, still is. And that's another story. He tells it much better than I do, but we were fortunate to work together from a startup, really, to floating on the AIM market and then eventually selling out. So, there aren't too many, but there are enough to keep us going and, enjoying what was going on.
I see you mentoring lots and lots of different people and businesses. You talked about how what I'm wondering is, do you have this ethos of you need to actually do it to learn? Because a lot of the stories you're describing there, you were thrown in the deep end, and you just went for it, and you had this mentality of just going for it. And likewise, when you started WGN, you had this brainwave of an idea. Let's roll up the fees. So is part of your mantra and part of your ethos when you're advising companies and advising businesses is actually just to sort of step outside the box and actually try and do it, and that's how you're going to learn these things? Is that fair?
Well, yeah. I mean, everything is relative, and in our early days, that first company we got involved in, looking back, I didn't know that much, but I knew more. The guy was a scientist. We became very close friends afterwards, and it was a really great story. But on the finance side, which I was sort of part-time FD, going around to his house in the back room, writing up the books, and it's a good story. But as you go on, if you're keen, you learn as you go along from people, from situations you're in, and you can pass those on to the next people. I think you said Phil Fraser's on the call, but I know he's had similar experience. You go through building up a business, and you can pass that knowledge on and your experiences, and that's what I try and do. And the other thing is very, very important is leveraging your contacts. You make a lot of contacts. You talk about networking.
Well, we're gonna talk about your networking,
and you can pass those on to people, to mutual benefit.
Talking of Phil, actually, he's wondering what the most profitable roll-up contra fees deal was.
Oh, come on, Phil. I might tell him privately. No, but we're fortunate. There's high risk, and everybody will tell you this. Business angels, if they're honest, experienced business angels, will say one or two investments will pay for all the others that don't make it. And it's the same with venture capitalists. It's always the same. There's only a few that will make it, and those are the ones you read about, and those are the ones that save you bacon, as you move forward. But literally the time, our time and expertise, if you like, is our currency, and we over the years have had to write off probably millions, but at the end of the day, some have been very successul running those good terms.
I've got a Facebook user wondering about your talented investments, and they're saying, is it better for individuals? Would you believe it is better for individuals, property or pensions, to invest in properties or pensions?
I've never really been involved too much in property, but I do believe in pensions, although again that's changed. When we started off, thank goodness, from absolute scratch, I made sure in those days the tax advantages were greater. I made sure I put the maximum percentage into pensions, and thank goodness I did, because 45 years on, at least it's a decent pension fund. Because when you're self-employed, as I say, nobody owes you a living, and you've got to do it all yourself. And all the sort of salary-based pension schemes that you get in big companies or in the civil service or what have you, that's fine. But if you're an individual, you have to do it. But pensions is another subject altogether. Yeah.
You talked about when you set up the accountancy firm, you weren't allowed to advertise. Just help me understand a bit more about the restrictions.
Yeah. In the professions, up till I can't remember, probably in the 70s. Up to then, you could be struck off if you were overtly advertising. So you had to rely on recommendations in the main, and I suppose networking. And then overnight, the Institute of Chartered Accountants changed it. And I always remember that week, because in the Financial Times, all the big PwC, for the Pricewaterhouse as they were then, and KPMG and Deloitte, massive adverts, whole page adverts in the FT. And then after a couple of weeks, they all faded away, because ultimately that isn't the way you get clients, for sure, and shouldn't be the way. But at least you weren't likely to be struck off by inadvertently or openly trying to advertise and get clients that way. So the professions were very old-fashioned in the way. The lawyers were the same, and then it all changed, and it has changed dramatically.
And has it gone? Has it? I assume at the time it was a good thing, but do you wonder if it's all gone a bit too far now?
Well, yeah, because some professional firms take an interest in it. They're very, very good at their marketing. Well, I wouldn't know how cost effective it is ultimately, because it's a long-term play. But the best way to get clients is by recommendation, for sure. But then you've got to put yourself around and not try and be selling. You've just got to build relationships, really.
And before we get on to building relationships, I just wanted to ask you about the British Business Bank. I mean, first of all, how did you even become a non-exec director? I believe you're only allowed to be one for 3 years. Are you disappointed that you're not a non-exec right now with the whole Sybil's and all the other loans that they've been throwing out? I guess it could have been an exciting time, I'm not sure, or a nerve-wracking time.
It was, I must say, it was fantastic getting the opportunity, which came completely out of the blue from a well-known firm of headhunters who I don't really deal with, but the guy was a really nice guy, and I'd come across him before. And out of the blue, he got in touch and said, look, there's something here. He knew I'd been a non-exec in some of the AIM companies where we'd taken companies to AIM, and I'd remained as non-exec. And he said, look, there's something here. It's called the British Business Bank, and it may be up your street, because their aim, it's a government organisation, and their aim is to get funding into small companies. I said, absolutely. I said, I'm interested. I knew nothing about it. And nowadays you can sort of, obviously on the internet, look at certain things. And one very interesting thing was one of the directors, who was the government representative, effectively, because it was owned by Bays or whatever the BIS, the Department of Business at that time. And I looked at this picture of this guy and I thought, I've met him before. And then I remembered one of the companies I've been involved in had won the Queen's Award. And they then got a visit from one of the ministers, and his civil servant was this guy. I called him a bag carrier. So when I went in for the interview, 4 interviews with 4 different people, I thought, I'm not going to mention anything for once in my life. And I didn't. And he looked at me and he says, haven't I seen you somewhere before? And then, we got friendly. But no, I went down. There were 4 interviews: the chairman, the CEO, the senior non-exec, and this government representative. And because I wasn't desperate for the job. I think I was relaxed and enjoyable, and I got offered it. And I think mainly because, first of all, they have to have diversity, and I was from the north, and I was involved in very small companies, which was the essence of what they were trying to get to, whereas all the other board members who I subsequently found, great people, and I learned a lot, and very, very nice people. I'm still friendly with them. They were really from either big companies or banks and what have you. And this was the first board they had put together after starting the company, which was an initiative from, I think, in the Lib Dem arena when there was the coalition on. So we had the initial board meeting, and then the board meetings were entirely different. Believe me, you can imagine part of the government. It was very exciting, and I met a lot of interesting people, including Matt Hancock when he was the junior minister, business minister. But then during that time, they decided it was Osborne who was the Chancellor, and he decided that he coined this phrase, the Northern Powerhouse, and decided they would open a fund called the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, which was really right up my street because it was in conjunction with the LEPs. I knew the people, and we set this up during that time, and I was quite sort of involved in that at a non-exec level, and that was it. But unfortunately, you only do 3 years, and myself and some of my colleagues stepped down at that time. We got the farewell party and gifts, but I'm still very friendly with some of the people. The CEO's just left, Keith Morgan, but the new one, Catherine Lewis Latour, came to the bank when I was there. So it's really good still being involved.
Well, how do you think, with this whole crisis and the facilities that they've opened here, the amount of money, where do you think the challenges for them going forwards are going to be?
Well, first of all, I think fair dues to the Chancellor and the government, the way they moved first to the civils, but then they found, although they were underwriting 80%, of the banks were doing it, and the government was underwriting 80%. The banks were still nervous, and they were making a bit of a meal of it, and so they brought in the bounce back loan, which has tipped it the other way. It's fantastic insofar you can get it in if you qualify within a day, a couple of days. But sadly, as always happens in these circumstances, there's been some fraud by a small number of unscrupulous people, and right this minute, HMRC haven't got the time, or the government haven't got the time to look into it, but I'm sure there will be a day of reckoning. I think it has been very, very important, and the British Business Bank have sort of overseen all this, but there needs to be more done to help, particularly the more early stage companies and those startups. And they brought in the Future Fund, but the bar that started, you had to raise $250,000 and then they would match it, which was ridiculous. They need to have something that's a much lower level. We know there's risk, but equally there's going to be a lot of people unemployed, and they need to encourage people to start businesses in the right kind of way. There used to be the enterprise allowance scheme some years ago, where I think they paid £100 a week to people who were going into business. A scheme like that, you're always going to lose some, and there's always going to be a bit of fraud and mismanagement, but it's not great compared with the benefits you get. And the more they can do, the better, really.
You, I've seen firsthand how you mentor businesses, and I like your style. I like you've got a huge breadth of advice. Do you think it was the non-exec role at the business was that part of the recognition in the step towards getting an OBE? Because I think it was rightly so, for certainly for the advice I've seen you give. How do you think that came about? It was a surprise for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think most people will tell you it's a surprise when you open the envelope and you look at it. Well, it looks an official envelope, so you think it's going to be some something you've done wrong, or XYZ. I don't know. Anyway, I opened it and I looked at it and I looked again, and I said to Vanessa, I said, just come and have a look at this, and I couldn't believe it. And then, of course, you're not allowed to say anything. Only Victoria Beckham sort of said something along the way, but most people stick by the rules, and you're not supposed to say anything until it's announced. And so there's a 2 month delay, and I didn't even tell my kids because it can soon get out. So only Vanessa knew. And then on New Year's Eve, or I think it was New Year's Eve, it's amazing how quickly it gets out. And it was really nice. People were good friends, and people I hadn't seen for ages were sending him messages. It was really, really good. And so it's a great honour. I know people decry it and say, well, he shouldn't have got it, and this one should have got it, and all the rest of it. Of course, you'll never get it right completely, and people put your name forward. Then you go, I think it goes in front of a committee. You will never actually know who put your name forward. It goes in front of a committee, and then they decide what to give you. So, there's MBE, OBE, and CBE, and I was fortunate to get an OBE, and it earns you a lot of brownie points with your wife, long-suffering wife and family, after all these years of work. So the day at the palace was really good. We were fortunate; it was nice weather. It was cold, and it was a good day out.
It's a hugely proud moment, isn't it? It's amazing. But just like a true accountant, you were bothered about the cost of the photos. Is that right?
Well, yeah, they are very expensive. I was working out how this firm must do, how many investitures there are, and there are hundreds of them. So it must do, and you can only go to this firm, but they've got it worked out to a T. So when you come out, there's groups of them there. I mean, it's amazing, and it's got to be like that. And they know exactly what photographs to take. And I can't believe anybody doesn't get them, regardless of the cost. But that was it.
I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about networking in a second. Just to remind you all, we're live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and you could be listening to us on a podcast. I've got a couple of questions that people have asked. So Adrian Wilson's just put that photos are a great investment. Funny that he's a photographer. We've got a couple of people on Facebook asking a question. Colin, if you were to be the judge on The Apprentice, and the team from Dragon's Den were your contestants, who would you most likely employ? There's a question for you, isn't there?
What do you mean, the team?
So which dragon would you employ?
Which dragon would I employ?
Who's your favourite dragon? Is it Peter or Deborah, or are we far off?
No, well, I think ultimately it is Peter, because I think he sticks to the business side of it, and he's pretty hard-nosed generally, and I think on balance. But look, it's a reality TV program. I've had a couple of businesses I've been involved with, one in particular that went on. I would never recommend anybody to go on it, but on the other hand, if you're up for it and you've got that kind of personality and you're prepared to be ritually humiliated, it's great publicity. And I think Phil did a program about people who had been on Dragon's Den, and they did get, even when you get ritually humiliated, you get a lot of publicity. And it just depends what kind of personality you've got.
Which you totally believe in the whole PR side of things. We talked about that earlier. As a risk taker, I'm surprised that you wouldn't jump at the opportunity to go on to get berated on Dragon's Den.
No, it's not my style, really. No.
Yeah. Someone's just asking Colin, on meeting Matt, I'm assuming Matt Hancock, did you think he had something special to take him to the position he's in today?
Absolutely not. It was. I'll tell you exactly what happened. It was the opening of the British Business Bank's offices, and it was a very modest do. It was just in the office, a few drinks and a few canapes and what have you, and a few people had come, including him. And we were chatting, and I thought, God, if he's a minister, he's very young. And this was about 5-6 years ago. And, seems a nice enough guy, but very young. I mean, didn't seem that sort of experienced in the field, but he's certainly experienced now. Love him or hate him, he's come on a lot, and he's had to learn the hard way. He was really thrown into the middle of it. So he looks a bit older now, probably a lot older. Yeah.
It's interesting that he didn't stand out then. So networking. I would like to talk to you about networking, because I agree with you. It's there's lots of different marketing channels, but like you said yourself, one of the best ways is being referred to. So when did you start networking? What made you start networking, and why you're very heavily invested in it? What are your top tips on networking?
Well, I suppose first of all, I just enjoy a challenge, and people are a challenge. I enjoy meeting people, and not so much now because I'm at the latter end of my career, but early on, especially at times when you couldn't advertise, you had to put yourself across and hope that somebody would then say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to come and see you," and talk about counselling and what have you. You couldn't actually. I mean, you could talk round the subject and what have you. So that was early doors, and I just found it very enjoyable and just great meeting people. And over the years, I've met some fantastic people. Sadly, you can't keep in touch with all of them all the time, but then they'll come out of the woodwork or wherever, and it's always pleasant to catch up with people. But above all, and look, I'm no expert on it. There is a guy who he's fantastic, and he's made a business out of it, a guy called Will Kintish. And if anybody, especially if a firm wants to engage him, I would say he is absolutely great. A lot of it is common sense, but he puts it across very well, and he runs courses, and he's got a very nice way about him. And he was an accountant, or he's an accountant, and what have you. But it's all about building relationships, and the worst thing you can do is try and sell. And there are some cases where you go to a do and people are overtly selling, some a bit more covertly. Ultimately, you always want to build a relationship because you want some mutual business at the end of the day. But you've got to be straight with people. But above all, just enjoy it and try and find ways that you can have mutual interests, or just try and help people as well. Not everything is about charging a fee. You can help people, and then hopefully it will come and pay back in due course.
Are you a firm believer that people buy from people?
Oh, definitely, yeah, definitely. I think the smallest way. I mean, my wife has just had 3 quotes from somebody who needed to chop a tree down, and she described the type of person, and we went for the person who wasn't the cheapest, but he just came across and was trying to be helpful and came up with suggestions. You can be cynical about this and say, well, it's the way to get the business, but it is about personalities and how you gel with people. But I've also dealt with people that I don't particularly get on with, but equally, in business, you've got to sometimes do that.
Are there any things that you wouldn't do at a networking? So you talked about you wouldn't sell. Anything else? Any tips that you'd avoid?
The other thing, which is the hardest thing, and everyone will say the same, is getting away from people. Not some because you definitely want to get away from them, but others because the whole point is in networking, getting around. So it's best to be up front, and some people are better being up front than others. And the other thing, which is less difficult, but is breaking into a group. You find more and more people are doing this. And now also, I think some younger people have been told by their firms, you've got to go out and network. And I, particularly with young lawyers, and really young ones compared with me, they've obviously been told to go out there and some really just haven't got the personality for it, and not really enjoying themselves. You can see this, but that's it. Of course, it's a whole new area. Sorry.
No. How do you break away from when you find yourself in a conversation that you really don't think you want to invest your time further in? Any top tips on what you'd say?
The best is to be up front and say, look, we're here to network, so good to meet you. Have you got your card or something, and then just move on. But sometimes it's not so easy to do that, and
I like
other things. But the best way is that.
I like it. And how do you choose? Do you give yourself a particular goal or a particular, how do you make sure that you're efficient or productive when you're going to a networking? How do you pick networking groups? How do you make sure that you're being efficient during those?
Well, to be honest, I've never measured it like that. I suppose you should really. I think what I do wherever possible, and I did a lot and it's quite demanding. You do need some help. Is I do write to them, email them, I should say, afterwards, to say genuinely good to meet you, and tell them a little bit about what I do, and leave it to them then. That often leads to a separate meeting, a one-to-one meeting, or whatever. And it doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes, they'll come back. It's a long play.
Colin's voice has gone a bit robotic there. Hopefully we've got him back.
Have we got it back?
Hopefully we've got him back. But yeah, I think I got the gist of that. And you're saying, try and be as productive as you can be. Colin, you're a keen runner as well. You run how many times a week do you run?
Well, since lockdown, I've been running probably at least 5, probably 6 days sometimes. But I'm coming to the end of my running career, which I'll say, back to the obsession. It was a friend of mine, actually, it was a small client who I think was equally obsessive, and he was talking about, this was back in the 80s, I think, running a marathon, and I was playing rugby at the time, so I thought, well, I'm reasonably fit, I'll have a go at this, and then I realised it's a whole different ball game. It was the Leeds Marathon, and they changed the course a number of times, and it was a horrendous course, starting from Rounded Park, going into South Leeds, and then eventually up through Headingley, back along the Ring Road, back to Rounded Park, 26 miles. And I got as far as Headingley, and I seized up. I struggled round in about, 4 or 5 hours, and then I was determined that I would do it again and do better. So I did train, and it and people know this, creates endorphins. So it's like being, on drugs, and you have to go, and you do anything to go out running. And also, it was much better when you have people to run with. So, I could ring people up and go out and run people, and that's it. Finally managed to do a marathon in 3:16, which I was quite proud of. But there we are.
And you did an amazing time in the marathon as well, didn't you?
Well, that was, to say, 3 hours 16 in London, I think, in 1986.
3 hours 16. That's brilliant. I'm going to bring this to a close, Colin. You've gone quite robotic, but I think we were pretty much at the end anyway. That's what happens nowadays with the reliance of online broadband, but it's been absolutely delightful, Colin. Colin, if people listening or watching wanted to speak to you, where's the best place to find you?
Well, I can give you my mobile, which I live is 07831 258 494.
Brilliant. And I'll put that in the show notes. And Colin, Colin is on LinkedIn, and he definitely will be in a networking room that you may visit next time. John Hammond asked a question: how many canapes has Colin consumed in his networking journey?
I don't know. Oh, John, I always like John's company, especially when I got on the wrong train in Amsterdam. Yeah, but because I was talking to him. But there we are. No. Yeah. Well, there's only a few canapes I can eat, but there we are.
Thanks so much. It's been really, I mean, I've known you for many years, but I've never really got under the skin and got to know you like I have today. It's been fascinating. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed it. I hope people have enjoyed it. Some good friends. That's it.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions. Right. Please make sure you subscribe for more, and we will see you next time. Take care.